My story today concerns a church with a very ancient legacy, in fact allegedly with connections to Satan himself. A church with a very, very weird tower, so strange in fact that there is no other church in this country that shares a similar design. And a church with a very, very controversial family, whose surname was given to the English language to mean something quite unpleasant. And also perhaps a connection to the Irish Revolution in Easter 1916.
In the land of Chaucer and Shakespeare stands many medieval churches risen with tall lofty spires or imposingly grand towers hewn from native stone, flint or brick. From any town or village their presence breaks the dullness of modern compliance to an age where England flourished through a profitable commerce and trade, which allowed the rich merchantmen of old to build these amazing edifices in honour perhaps to their own mortality and the absolute certainty of an eternal resting place to quietly slumber through the ages of time. Such a place is St Mary the Virgin at Burgh St Peter in Norfolk, an imposing structure built of English brick and flint, and dressed with the mellow colours of a neatly trimmed thatch roof, since being built in the years of Chaucer from around 1300 onwards. Huddled around its haunch walls lie centuries of congregations, buried like huddled masses, with each period of history represented by faded stones etched with a lifelong past, and as with most churches, an uncertain future as man and nature move forward together into new eras. Standing but a few hundred feet from the River Waveney, it lies almost lost to time on a small plateau looking out across the valley below, and seemingly away from the mindset of a modern world that has walked on by. The church was altered and added to during the era of Shakespeare, but lost its original tower around the year 1600. It is believed that an earlier and long-gone church had stood in the village since Saxon times, but no trace of it exists today, other than that recorded to parchment or vellum. By the time Samuel Boycott became rector of the church in 1764, the church was much in need of renovation, and so he decided to kill two birds with one stone by rebuilding the tower on the base of the earlier one and turning it into a family mausoleum. The names of those interred here and also within the churchyard are carried on brass plaques affixed to the pulpit, which was built by his son William, another rector here, in 1816. The tower, as can be seen, is unusually unique and a prime example of Georgian Gothic. The inspiration of its design originally came from William, who saw Ziggurat temples in Mesopotamia during his grand tour. The tower, loosely based on this concept, was originally finished with a towering finial, which has sadly since disappeared by 1920 when this photo was taken, which is oddly ironic, as in the original ziggurats the top was crested by a shrine. There were no access points to the roof of the tower, and so if the flag be needed to be flown, one of the choir boys would scour the outside of the tower to raise or lower it. It is not known if any died, but I'm certain that there were many injuries. In 1841, the Boycotts, who had descended from French Huguenot stock, had decided to change the family name to Boycott, a name which became notorious by the end of that century, and also for its use as a new word in the English dictionary. The Boycotts managed to retain the living at Burgh St Peter for over 150 years before the last rector, William Douglas Boycott, left the church to take up a new post in 1899 at Wymondham in Norfolk, and he died in 1932. But my tale today concerns not any of the church clerics, but of Samuel's actual great-grandson, a Charles Cunningham Boycott, who took a very different route to that of his family, by preferring a career in the military instead. It is said, whether this is true or not I cannot say, that in the English landed gentry the smartest entered the church and the less academically gifted joined the army. Perhaps Charles was a case in point. In 1848 he entered the military by attending the Royal Military Academy in Woolwich, where he hoped to join the Royal Corps of Engineers. But he was discharged from the academy in 1849 after failing a periodic exam. His family were then forced to take the well-trodden route of buying him a commission as an officer in the 39th Regiment of Foot. His first and only posting was to Ireland, where he married a local woman from Dublin in 1852. After a bout of illness, he sold his commission to remain in Ireland, where he leased a farm in County Tipperary, where he acted as a small-scale landlord. Boycott soon ran into trouble with the locals. He was accused of interfering in an election and also looting a wrecked ship which was stranded on the island, where he allegedly removed the goods to his farm. Boycott's true personality was to come to the fore from 1873, when he moved to Loch Mask House, owned by a wealthy absent landlord, Lord Erne, 4 miles from Ballinrobe in County Mayo. Here he agreed to be Lord Erne's agent for 1,500 acres that he owned in the county. One of Boycott's responsibilities was to collect rents from tenant farmers on the land, for which he received a 10% of the total rent due to Lord Erne, which was around £500 each year. According to the author Joyce Marlowe, Boycott had hardened in his attitude towards the Irish following his somewhat fraught experiences on Achill. He certainly acted in a very contrary manner to the people employed by him, and was suggested to have behaved as he saw fit, without regard to other people's points of views or feelings. Examples of that attitude were manifested by his unpopularity with his employees and tenant farmers, and becoming a local magistrate only hardened that attitude against him. He was accused as such by not allowing gates to be left open and not allowing hens to trespass on his property, and that he fined anyone who transgressed these restrictions. He also had withdrawn privileges from the tenants, such as collecting wood from the estate, and in August 1880 his labourers had enough. They went on strike in a dispute over a wage increase. Tenant farmers were generally engaged on 1-year leases and could be evicted at any time, even if they paid their rents. Some of the tenants were large farmers who farmed over 100 acres, but the majority were much smaller, on average between 15 and 50 acres. Many small farmers worked as labourers on the larger farms. The poorest agricultural workers were the landless labourers who worked on the land of other farmers. In October 1879, Michael Davitt, the son of a tenant farmer, formed the Irish National Land League. The Land League's aims were to reduce rents and to stop evictions, and in the long term to make tenant farmers owners of the land they farmed. Davitt asked Irish nationalist Charles Stewart Parnell to become the leader of the League, and in 1880 Parnell was also elected leader of the Home Rule Party. On the 19th of September 1880, Parnell gave a speech in Ennis, County Clare, to a crowd of Land League members. He suggested that in dealing with the landowners that they should be ostracised and completely ignored at every opportunity, and leaving them in a moral Coventry. Boycott's problems with striking labourers were about to go global following Parnell's rousing speech. In the same month, Lord Erne's tenants were due to pay their rents. He had agreed to a 10% reduction owing to a poor harvest, but all except 2 of his tenants demanded a 25% reduction. Boycott, as agent to Lord Erne, was placed in a very difficult place. Boycott said that he had written to Lord Erne and that Erne had refused to accede to the tenants' demands. He then issued demands for the outstanding rents and obtained eviction notices against 11 tenants. 3 days later, after Parnell's speech in Ennis, a process server and 17 members of the Royal Irish Constabulary began to attempt to serve Boycott's eviction notices. Legally, they had to be delivered to the head of the household or his spouse within a certain period of time. The process server successfully delivered notices to 3 of the tenants, but a 4th, a Mrs. Fitzmaurice, refused to accept the notice and began waving a red flag to alert other tenants that the notices were being served. The women of the area descended on the process servers and the constabulary and began pelting them with stones, mud and manure, which succeeded in driving them away to seek refuge in Lockmask House. They tried again the following day, but again they were unsuccessful. By now news had spread and many people descended on Lockmask House, where they were able to drive away the servants either by choice or threats. Eventually all employees, whether working in the house or on the land, had left, and Boycott was under pressure to bring in his own crops without any help. Within days every trade, shop and business refused to serve Boycott. This left him to import his own food from outside the district. In frustration, Boycott wrote to the British Times newspaper and gave an account of the situation he was experiencing. The Times responded by dispatching a reporter who interviewed Boycott and reported that he had £500 worth of crops that would rot unless he could find people willing to help him. Boycott also reported that he had been told to leave. The British national newspapers rallied together and raised over £2,000, a large sum for 1880, to finance a party of men to travel to Boycott's estate to bring in the crops. Very shortly things became a lot worse as a result through the Boycott Relief Fund that was prepared to send armed men to help workers brought into the area to remove the crops. These men, being Protestants of the Orange Order, had little empathy with the Catholic majority. The Irish saw this expedition as an invasion. The British, wary of another sectarian war, quickly quashed the armed expedition and instead offered a military escort to allow 50 unarmed workers to remove the crops. These men were drawn from the Protestant minority in County Cavan and County Monaghan. Boycott said that he only needed 15 labourers, as he had brought in the grain crop himself, and rumours abounded that the willing labourers would be attacked, but nothing came of it and the root crops were harvested. The entire cost of providing escorts and transport to remove the harvest cost the British government £10,000. In Parnell's words, it was 1 shilling for every turnip dug from Boycott's land. Boycott later claimed that he had lost £6,000 of his own investment in the estate. On the 27th of November 1880, Boycott, his family and a local magistrate were escorted from Lockmask House by members of the 19th Hussars. A carriage had been hired for the family, but no driver could be found for it, and so an army ambulance and driver had to be used instead. The ambulance was escorted to Claremorris railway station, where Boycott and his family boarded a train to Dublin, where Boycott was received with some hostility. The hotel he stayed in received letters saying that it would be boycotted if Boycott remained. He had intended to stay in Dublin for a week, but Boycott was advised to cut his stay short. He left Dublin for England on the Holyhead mail boat on the 1st of December. By now the term boycott had been given to the English language. The idea arose from a meeting by Father O'Malley in a discussion with a British-American journalist, James Redpath. O'Malley, who was very much involved in the Land League reforms from the outset and believed that using the term ostracised may be too hard for the local peasantry to understand. But by replacing it with the verb boycott and referencing the current climate, people would understand. And so the hapless Charles Boycott inadvertently perhaps gave his name to the English dictionary, where the term is often used in industrial disputes. The word also entered the lexicon of language such as Dutch, French, German and Polish and Russian. And what of Boycott? Despite visiting New York incognito as Charles Cunningham, his arrival in New York generated a great deal of media attention, and the New York Tribune said, "The arrival of Captain Boycott, who had voluntarily added a new word to the language, is an event of something like international interest." Boycott stayed a few months visiting friends before once more returning home to England
where in 1886 he became a land agent for Hugh Adair at Flixton in Suffolk. He remained in post until the 19th of June 1897, when he died suddenly at home in Flixton, aged 65 and following ill health, with his body being buried back home in the churchyard of Burgh St Peter, where he lies today. Boycott may be long gone, but his actions back in Ireland in 1880 may have laid the incendiary template for Irish Home Rule, and by 1922 the Irish Free State was formed after the British left the southern part of the country to retain the northern counties of Ulster. By 1937 the Irish Free State was renamed the Irish Republic, which remains today. Burgh St Peter may be a beautiful place, but the church and grounds has a distinct feel that many have reported after visiting there. During my time at the site, I wandered freely within the church and cemetery, but felt at every moment there was someone or something very close by. The sensation is not ugly or dangerous, but it is an energy that is palpable. It offers no threats but a simple curiosity for anyone who visits. And yet this isolation does not remove the church from the outside world. Nearby is a river centre and parking for caravanners or boaters. But for the many who stay there, the church is something of an oddment that exists at the end of the trackway, and in some ways it feels deliberately so, despite the church tower being omnipresent to the locality. But there are no recorded ghost hauntings that are shared. But there is an ancient story that suggests the origins of the church. It would appear that in the year 1101 AD, a man named Adam Morland sold his soul to the devil for a very substantial sum of money, after which he left the country. Upon his return many years later, he erected a church at Burgh St Peter, on the foundations of which the present church was built. A few days after the church had been consecrated, Adam died and was buried in the churchyard with full religious rites. Now, for some time prior to Adam's death, an old man had been seen around the village, clutching in his hand a roll of parchment and speaking to nobody. On the day of Adam's funeral, this old man was seen to become very excited and followed the cortege to the church, but would not enter. As Adam's body was lowered into its final resting place, the old man was heard to swear that he would wait until the day of resurrection to collect Adam's soul. That night, when the sexton went to lock up the church, he saw that the old man was still there, and so asked if he could help him. The old man slowly lifted his head, and the sexton saw to his horror that within the hood which the old man was wearing, a hideous grinning skull glowing from within. Terror-stricken, the sexton fled to the village to find the priest. Both of them returned to the church armed with crucifixes and holy water. As they approached, the hooded skeleton stood up and vanished in a flash of flame, leaving behind terrible brimstone vapours. And every year after this terrible incident, on the anniversary of Adam's death, that hooded figure was seen again outside the church. When the old church was rebuilt in the 16th century, it was assumed that the apparition would no longer appear. However, this was not to be, for now not only did the hooded skeleton appear, but so did a host of others all around the churchyard wall. It is said that the awful apparition can still be seen on the 2nd of May each year, the anniversary of Adam's death.